On today's show, who is the Houston Rockets' best closing option at this point, and why this playoffs could absolutely be make or break for Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, and Fred VanVleet. It's coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. Also, check out our Locked On Rockets newsletter. Would sincerely appreciate all of that support. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. Joining us now is special friend of the program, Dave Hardisty, aka ClutchFans OG himself, to talk about the Houston Rockets and this kind of dilemma that's been plaguing this team all season long, Dave. And it kind of reared its ugly head there against the Lakers. We've seen it in various games throughout this season, but the lack of, I guess, a closer or the lack of a go-to guy in crunch time situations for this team. So we're going to talk about that for a minute, as well as getting into kind of a bigger picture look ahead, I should say, at the playoffs and whether or not this postseason is going to be make or break for anybody on this Rockets roster, which maybe seems like a bit of a jump for their first appearance in the postseason under Ime Udoka. But let's start first with that kind of question, Dave, about the closing issues for this team. We saw it against the Lakers. We've seen it against other teams throughout the season. But this Rockets team also has the most clutch wins in the NBA. They're 26-18 in the clutch. But we've also seen them lose some clutch games. Where do you stand on this kind of idea about this team lacking a go-to guy, lacking a closer? How do you feel about where this team is at right now?
Well, I feel, first of all, that I think that looking specifically at Jalen and Sengun, who are kind of the players that the Rockets have looked at right now as sort of being their closers or their offensive stars, it's TBD, really. And that's how it is. That's why people talk about the Rockets. They could go to the West Finals. They could lose in the first round. We really just don't know. They're so inexperienced. So I don't want to draw any conclusions yet. I want to see how they do in the playoffs. But I think if you look at the Rockets overall and just their numbers on the season, they do so many things that a championship team or a championship caliber team does. They dominate the rebounds. They're number one in the league in field goal attempts per game. They own possessions by just outshooting you in a game. But the one thing that they are not good at, that they are down there at the very bottom with lottery teams, is shooting, just overall scoring. And I think that is in part, it's not just the role player shooters around those guys. It's in part because of Jalen and Sengun, who are sort of the stars. They're a little bit lower, true shooting percentage, field goal percentage for star players, for lead players. They've had very good years. I'm trying to criticize them, but I think that's still very much TBD. We want to see both of those guys become more efficient before you can say that's your closer. And so I'm not saying that they're not closers, but right now it hasn't come to fruition. I think we need to see that more over time. And I think the playoffs will be a very big indicator for the front office.
What's weird to me is I feel like throughout this season in particular, we've seen different kind of versions of this team, right? Where sometimes Al P is the closer, sometimes Jalen is the closer, hell, sometimes Fred is the closer, or Dillon, and that kind of goes back to the whole, sometimes you, sometimes me, always us kind of mentality, mantra, whatever that this team has embodied this season. Now, obviously, more often than not, it's one of Jalen or Sengun, but I think this was really apparent in that loss to the Lakers, and it's going to look even worse potentially in a first round series against whoever the Rockets line up with, or as they're closing out this season, the gauntlet of games that they have. They still got to deal with LA again. They're going to see the Thunder. They're going to see the Nuggets. They're going to see the Clippers and the Warriors. Is dealing with these upper echelon teams, dealing with these playoff caliber teams. the Rockets are going to be tested. They're going to be tested, and we're going to see, and we're going to get kind of a little bit of a playoff preview glimpse at how these teams are going to try and target and shut down both Jalen and Sengun, especially late in games. But as it stands right now, Dave, I kind of feel like, and I'm gonna get flambéed for this. I just know it. I feel like Jalen Green is just a little bit more equipped to be a better closer at the end of games, depending on obviously if he's hot or not that night. If he's making shots, that's kind of the big thing. But LP, I feel like, has had moments where he can be a good closer, but he's so dependent on the Rockets finding a way to get him the ball, and that's where Fred VanVleet steps in. Right, he's the one guy on the roster who can consistently and routinely deliver passes to Sengun when he gets a seal, when he gets a post up, whatever. But seeing how easily the Lakers kind of schemed him out of the offense, especially at the end of the game, well, throughout the whole game, but then even especially at the end, right? LeBron clamping Sengun one-on-one, the weak side block at the end, all that stuff. I just don't know what it's going to look like in the postseason once we get there. And I kind of feel like Jalen is the Rockets' best closing option at this point.
Oh, you are preaching to the choir 100% there. I fully agree with you on this. Now, Sengun's been really good in a lot of situations, but this kind of a game, what we saw with the Lakers, you would think on paper Sengun would feast. And right out of the gate, he did. He had a couple of floaters. He made a layup. And before you knew it, he had 6 points on 3 of 3 shooting. I think he finished with 6 at the half, if I remember correctly. They just, like you said, kind of schemed it, made it very difficult, fronted him quite a bit, never put any real traditional big on him. I think Jackson Hayes only played a couple of minutes in the second half. And they just made it really difficult for Sengun to get the ball or work with the ball. And, the Lakers are one of those teams that guys can shoot threes. In this particular game, you had Finney-Smith basically and Gabe Vincent go off, but in other games it might be Rui or Austin Reeves. And it's a tough game because they're small, but being a small ball team in the way they played, they're still quite big. Luka is big, LeBron's big, Rui is big. So it's a tough matchup for the Rockets. I will say this, the Rockets didn't play particularly well, and they were very close on the road against this team. But you could see as well the Lakers playing better. Like I said, Austin Reeves did not have a good game. Rui Hachimura, who's been a 41% three-point shooter this year, 42% last year, did not shoot well at all in the game as well. So that's going to be a tough matchup if the Rockets face it. And you could see that with OKC. You could see that with Golden State as well. So Ime is going to have to find ways, in my opinion, to counter some of the things that you do when you have a Sengun and or an Adams out there on the floor.
And I'm glad you bring that up because that's where as much as I want to say, okay, well, Jalen just has to be better in closing moments or Sengun has to be better in these closing moments, I do still walk away thinking, one of my biggest takeaways, and we talked about this in our recap pod with Madison talking about the Lakers game, is there's just so many moments of guys just standing around. There's nothing happening. There's no actions being run. There's nobody's calling. Sengun's not getting a screen to try and get LeBron off of him to try and get to a better mismatch against a smaller player, or again, guys running the baseline to provide outlet passes to when the double team does come. And I just feel like that is just such a damning indictment of the coaching staff. And so while I do think there need to be moments where both Jalen and Sengun, they're the big boys, they're being paid the big bucks, they need to be the closers, they need to be the guys to save this Rockets team or deliver the buckets in those crunch time situations. That's what they're getting paid to do. That's what the expectation is for those two guys to be your two best players on the team. That being said, it doesn't really feel like Udoka's doing them many favors, especially watching the end of how that Lakers game kind of played out.
Yeah, I can see that. I think that there were some, I've seen some good breakdowns of the final few minutes, and Jalen obviously didn't have a very good game. Comes off the Western Conference Player of the Week. He did not play particularly well. Frankly, he didn't to start the game in Phoenix before he kind of took off, but didn't play well in this game and didn't really close. So I can understand that aspect of it. But yeah, I do think Ime got out-coached overall. Redick, especially on the boards. I think that was a big factor because, the Rockets, I think, out-rebounded them by 5 or 6 boards. But for the most part, when Sengun and Adams were out there, those smalls were knocking loose balls away, knocking it out. Or they would just be some bad bounces that didn't go Houston's way. And that's one of the biggest advantages the Rockets enjoy in order to create more opportunities. They'll miss shots. Rockets will get the board and just they overwhelm teams with that. And that didn't really happen against the Lakers. But you're right. Ime is going to have to be more and more creative to get Sengun involved in these type of setups. Teams are going to scheme to make it tough on him. They're going to double him. They're going to front him. And Ime is going to have to get more offensively creative.
Coming up in this playoffs, is it make or break for anybody on this Rockets roster? It might seem really, really early to make that claim, but we're going to pose an argument or two that might change your mind, as well as what we need to see this postseason from Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, and Fred VanVleet, of all people. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Baseball season is in full swing, and there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections, and if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash, whether it's strikeouts, RBIs, or first inning runs. Prize Picks keeps every game exciting. When I'm building my lineup this week, I'm picking Jose Altuve for more than 1 home run and Jeremy Pena for more than 1 RBI. It's that easy. They are fast. They're simple. Setting up a lineup takes less than 60 seconds. And when you win, the payout is quick, safe, and secure. So download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code LOCKEDONNBA for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Run your game. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Dave, the question at hand here is this playoffs, is this postseason going to be make or break for anybody on the Rockets roster? And this might seem really early to ask this question, but I want to make the argument here really quick to anybody who's like rolling their eyes thinking, oh my God, Jackson's overreacting, and here he goes. So just trying to, make something out of nothing. Here's my thing. This team was on the precipice of making the postseason last year, right? I think if this team had gotten its way, right, maybe a couple things break differently. Tari doesn't miss a quarter of this, 75% of the season. Sengun doesn't get hurt at the end of the year, whatever. They're in the play-in tournament last year, and they get a good look at some of these young guys in the playoff kind of atmosphere, and they can start gathering some data points then. And then you have this season to gather additional data points. So you would have gotten kind of 2 sets of postseason experience to then evaluate and decide, okay, who's going to be here long term? Who's thriving in the postseason? Who do we need to look at replacing? All that kind of stuff. I feel like even though this is going to be the first taste of playoff basketball for many of the players up and down this Rockets roster, given how the NBA works and how you have to juggle the timing of when certain extensions are kicking in and how you're paying certain guys, and basically really starting to make some of those hard decisions about, okay, when are you going to start kind of consolidating maybe some of these young guys and making a quote unquote all-in move or figuring out which pieces are here to stay and who needs to go. I feel like there are going to be some make or break kind of performances in this postseason for some of the guys on this Rockets roster, where then you make it to the offseason and you have to make some hard decisions.
Yeah, and I don't know for sure, but I feel that it's going to be the case. I still look at the Rockets long term. I think they're ahead of schedule. Being number 2 seed, I certainly didn't expect it. I don't think the Rockets expected to be 2, given how strong the West is. But, I mean, they've been terrific. So I'll give them all the credit in the world from front office down. But I still think they have to look at this like OKC is right now what used to be Golden State. We are trying to beat OKC eventually. Does this team have the roster organically to just beat them eventually, to grow together and be a better team than OKC? I personally don't think so. I think they're going to have to make some sort of change to add a significant player down the line. But I think going into these playoffs, you do have the Fred angle. That's one aspect because you have a team option. You're gonna decline that and extend him, or you're gonna pick it up, try to trade him, or just roll with that and go one more year. Amen seems like he's grown quite a bit, even a little bit as a point guard. Do you want to run with Amen, Jalen next year? That's one absolute factor. But then the other is kind of what we were discussing before. I think you have to look at Jalen and Sengun as well. Granted, they're only 22, 23 years old. It's still very early, but they got paid like stars, and I think that they are going to be judged a little bit in these playoffs based on how they do as stars, as higher dollar contracts. So those are the three players that I would look at in these playoffs. And I'm not saying make or break, but I think that those three, they have done a lot of things to make sure that they kept this team together to get this data from the playoffs. They're definitely going to make some decisions based on what they see.
And for anybody who's sitting here thinking, and this is the really hard part, and this is why I am not envious of the Rockets coaching staff, the front office, right? They have to make these really tough decisions. But at the end of the day, I'll give you a really, I think, what is probably a pristine example here, and that's last season. The OKC Thunder were incredible, right? Best team in the West. They were fantastic. And they had what felt like a square peg in a round hole with Josh Giddey on their roster.
Yes.
And they still experienced so much success last season. They got to the postseason. They saw what it looked like with Josh Giddey and SGA and the rest of that roster. And they made a really hard decision. They said, you know what? We're going to trade Giddey, right? He doesn't fit. It's not going to work long term. We tried to make it work with him and SGA next to each other. This is not the best version of our team. And that's what I feel like is the kind of decision that this Rockets team might be faced with this postseason. Now, I do not subscribe at all to the notion that Jalen and Sengun cannot coexist. I think on paper, and for anybody with a pair of eyeballs watching these games, the two-man game between those guys should be the backbone of this Rockets offense and should look phenomenal, especially when those guys are both playing at their best capabilities. They look incredible. They can play off of each other, all that stuff. I would like to see a little bit more offensive creativity from Ime at times and how to build an offense around those two guys in particular. Some of that's going to require Jalen to become a little bit more competent at getting LP the ball in certain spots where he wants it. That's where Fred VanVleet comes in as kind of the one-trick pony a little bit about being able to spoon-feed LP in all the spots that he likes the ball, whether it's on the roll or in the short roll or, getting a seal on a post-up, that kind of thing. But at least in theory, Sengun and Jalen should absolutely be able to coexist with one another and look really good doing it. That said, if either of them goes into this postseason and just completely struggles, like I'm talking lays a massive egg, I don't know if the Rockets have enough or will have enough grace to then walk away from that and think, you know what? Okay, we'll give it another chance next season. Because we see how quickly these windows come and pass, right, Dave? Like just 2 years ago, the Sacramento Kings were the third seed in the Western Conference. And they looked like they were on the come up. They had Sabonis, they had Fox, they had all the young talent around those guys. They had an identity. They were high octane on offense. Mike Brown, winning coach of the year, all that stuff. And how quickly the Kings fell from grace. Now they're 2 years later, and the team looks completely different. Their star player requested out, and they fired their head coach, and they're barely flirting with a play-in spot at this point. So I don't think the Rockets are a team that can necessarily rest on their laurels, even after overachieving and having a mountain of success this season. They can't just sit here and say, okay, well, if Sengun looks awful in the playoffs or Jalen looks awful in the playoffs, just run it back, be like, oh, they're young, we'll give them one more year. I feel like they're gonna have to make hard decisions if either of those guys struggle or look really bad in the postseason.
Yeah, I don't have a good feel whether they will, but I'm with you again 100% on this. I feel like they should. And I'm glad you brought up Giddey. Giddey to me is a floor raiser. I was not high on Giddey at all. But he has look what he's doing in Chicago. He's improved as a three-point shooter. He is clearly raising the floor in Chicago. How high the ceiling will be, I don't know. But nobody in OKC is questioning that trade. I mean, it literally was sort of taking a weakness out, a guy who really wasn't very good shooting threes, who was a clear weakness defensively. Ime Udoka knows that well, was exploiting Giddey every single time they faced OKC. OKC is now a juggernaut, like one of the best teams we've ever seen, at least, analytically. So I'm not saying the Rockets necessarily have that. I do think, though, when I look at Giddey, I'm looking at Sengun in the sense that Sengun next year has to add the three-point shot. It's not a nice to have or, be good if he could add it. He's going to have to add it, especially with a man on the team. And Jalen's, he's inching up. This is his career high in three-point shooting, but really got to get that thing up to 37, 38% to be, truly deadly for what he does. So there's question marks with both of those guys. But I think if you're the Rockets, you've got so many things on this team that say you've got this great defense. great defensive wings. You've got in my opinion, a special player. In my opinion, the best player on the team personally, this is my view, is Amen Thompson, a guy who's a two-way force and should be growing as he goes. You have to think about building around that. And I think this postseason, things that happen will certainly come into the equation as they make decisions this offseason.
I want to piggyback off that point you just made about building with the idea of Amen Thompson down the line, as well as circling back to the point about Fred VanVleet and his potential future with this team. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Look, if you ever check your bank account and wonder where did all your money go between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's really easy to lose track. That's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app, it's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place, so you stop just managing your money and start building your wealth. Look, when I started using Monarch Money, honestly, I was embarrassed at how much I was spending on eating out each and every month. I realized I needed to cut back, and I was able to start budgeting smarter and saving more. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off of your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your very first year. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Dave, you brought up a really interesting point there, and I think that's kind of maybe you said it more eloquently or got to kind of the place that I was trying to get to with some of my initial thought process there is at some point this Rockets team has to start making those long-term decisions of what do they think the true future identity of this team is. Because to me, what's happened so far through the first couple years of the Ime Udoka era is they've basically just put together a bunch of really good pieces, not necessarily pieces that are very complementary of one another, right? Like, we've yet to see an iteration of this Rockets team where they're like, okay, you know what? We believe in Alperen Sengun 110%. We think he's baby Jokic or Sabonis light or whatever, and we're going to put all this shooting around him, and he's going to, we're going to run all the offense through him, shin hub, and he's going to collapse the defense, and he's going to kick it out to these guys who are just dead-eye shooters, 39, 40, 41% from deep, and that's going to be our system to success, right? We haven't seen that. We haven't seen a version of this team where Ime Udoka has put the ball in Amen Thompson's hands and surrounded him with four shooters and basically said, get downhill at will, right? The textbook, play from Russell Westbrook OKC days, right? That was the blueprint there, was give the ball to Russ or even Giannis right now, right? Give the ball to Giannis, put four shooters around him, let him get downhill and see what happens. Or Jalen Green, right? Jalen Green's another one. We haven't seen this team catered to any one particular player yet. And so it kind of feels like they're experiencing this level of success despite the fact that some of these pieces don't necessarily fit perfectly together. And to your point about the future of this team potentially, Sengun is the team's best player right now. He is. He's been the best player for about a year and a half. Jalen Green has grown tremendously and gotten to a place where he's much more consistent, where I have a tremendous amount of confidence in his play on a night-to-night, game-to-game basis, which is phenomenal. But Amen Thompson is probably more than likely the future best player on this team. It's hard not to see it now as we're approaching the end of his second year in the NBA. You see flashes of superstardom there. And he's still so young and he's still so raw offensively, but he's also gotten exponentially better on the off. Like, the fact that he's just this season alone has added like the crafty Euro steps and the finishes where he just elevates over the top of the defense inside the paint and just like drops the ball in basically because he's so high when he jumps that he's like shooting down into the rim sometimes, it feels like. Once he adds a little bit more of a consistent perimeter shot, and I feel very confident in saying that it's not an if, that it's a win, because he's such a basketball psycho, and the fact that the corner threes already look as good as they do, I'm not worried about his long-term ability to have at least a respectable outside shot to open up the rest of his game and get to his downhill driving and all of that. And he's improved as a playmaker. He's done so much this season. I think the Rockets are going to have to really, as early as this offseason, start heavily looking at, okay, do these pieces fit with Amen Thompson? That is going to be, I think, the number one checkbox that you have to check. If you're going to be a player on the Rockets roster, do you fit next to Amen Thompson? And to your point about Alperen Sengun, I feel like those two guys, there's a world where they can coexist if neither of them are shooting the basketball particularly well. But the margin for error becomes kind of razor thin, right? Because when you have that lack of spacing, so to speak, offensively, you have to supplement that with great ball movement, cutting, passing, all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, it crowds things and it makes it really easy for opposing teams to game plan against both of those guys.
Yeah, Sengun and Amen have had really good chemistry, especially, with Amen in the dunker spot. Sengun getting the double. He reads Amen really well. So, and Sengun does that in general with just about anybody. He did that a few times last night, the other night against the Lakers. So that part is good. The fact that just on paper that both of them can't shoot threes right now is a problem. Maybe, both of them have that potential. I think Sengun should have more potential, to be honest with you. I thought he'd be a little bit farther at this point of his career. But I really do believe the Rockets front office right now is already looking at it the way you're describing it. Maybe it's not 100% that way. They're still playing it out with all of these, young players. Let's see who grows. They know what they have with Amen Thompson. They know he's a special player. He has to grow more offensively. He has shown a lot of growth since last year. He's had some big assist games this year. He's gotten a little bit tighter with his handles, still a little bit sloppy here and there. And the 3-point shot has gotten better. It's still bad, but it's way better than the 15% or so it was as a rookie. So I think they know they already have a defensive superstar on their hands and a guy who, just with his speed, his athleticism, his size, they know they have something truly unique. So I do think they are already taking that approach. And I'm not saying that, we're going to move anybody out to build 100% around Amen Thompson. They just know that there's one guy for sure who they want to keep. Again, we have to point out that, Luka was traded, so anything can happen. But that's how they view this. They are so high, ridiculously high on Amen Thompson. I think they're justified to do that. That's sort of their view going into the playoffs. But at the same time, if you're just looking at offensive side of the floor, Jalen and Sengun are probably ahead of him right now. He's more efficient than those players, but those guys are certainly receiving a lot more double teams than him. So it's going to be a really important, the playoffs are going to show us a lot, but it's going to be really important to see how those top two guys go. But Amen is here for the long haul for sure.
And I guess that kind of to build off of that, right, that kind of bleeds into this next part of the discussion to me is, I think the biggest question mark really about what's going to happen, in the postseason is we've seen, this has been a really down year for Fred VanVleet. There's no sugarcoating it. His numbers are down across the board. He's really struggled to shoot the basketball, and that's like I can't say that's the one thing that the Rockets pay him to do, but it's the one expectation for him offensively is, he's not a downhill threat. He's not a guy that has this dynamic ability to really create his own shot and put points on the board by himself in isolation or whatever. His job is to be able to knock down open threes that are generated by the actions initiated from Jalen Green or from Alperen Sengun, the double teams that those guys command. And when he's not doing that on a consistent basis, he's really hurting the Rockets offense. And then when you see a game like the Lakers game where he's also getting hunted defensively because of his size, it really starts to beg the question, what does the future look like with Fred VanVleet, with the Rockets? And is there a world where the Rockets would feel confident enough after this postseason to potentially move on from Fred VanVleet in some capacity, right? You brought it up earlier, the idea that, would you be willing to just go with Jalen Green and Amen Thompson as your primary ball handlers and maybe a little bit of, some Reed Shepherd here and there situationally as they're very high on him internally and they think that, he has a very, very bright future. But I think that this postseason is going to be the most telling for the future of any of these three guys. Is going to be it'll have the most to do with Fred VanVleet, right? And his future with the Rockets, because if Fred struggles in the playoffs, I don't know how the Rockets can realistically look at his body of work this past season, plus poor performance in the playoffs, plus the growth and advancement of Jalen Green and Amen Thompson as primary ball handlers by necessity in that gap where Fred VanVleet wasn't playing due to injury. I don't know how they look at all that into all those different little, pieces of the formula and walk away thinking, yeah, we want to bring him back next year. We want to keep him as the starting guard next year. I'm not going to say Fred VanVleet's been a weak link for this team. He's not been. He's absolutely still an important part of kind of the chain of pieces of this team that keeps things well oiled and running smoothly. But at the same time, I do wonder if the ceiling of this team would be a lot higher if they just kind of trusted, you know what, Jalen, Amen, you guys are our primary ball handlers. Go out there, see what you got. You have to live with some of the turnovers. You have to live with some of the poor decision making and stuff. But there might be a legitimate argument to be made that it's time for them to kind of remove the training wheels that are Fred VanVleet, depending on how this postseason looks.
Yeah, I think if they go with that route, there would certainly be a lot more variance. Like you said, maybe you have a higher ceiling. You might slip back some because the turnovers are huge. Ime, every coach like this, dating back to Jeff Van Gundy that I can remember with the Rockets, they want somebody who will not turn the ball over. That is what Fred VanVleet is for Ime Udoka, a security blanket to run the show. But when you go back to the front office and look at, the 2023 offseason, when they signed Fred, remember they tried to get Brook Lopez as well on a rich deal, but for 2 years. They were going to overpay Brook. They were willing to overpay Fred. But it was really a 2-year deal in Fred's case with a 3rd-year team option. And it was always intended to be a bridge. They had already drafted Amen, and they kind of hoped that would be, he would be able to take the reins of point guard. I don't know if we're there yet or not, but you do have that sort of, I'll use the term security blanket again, with a 3rd-year option. Very rich, mind you, $40+ million. But I think regardless of what even happens in the playoffs, they do have to make a decision with Fred, because all along the talk has been sort of decline that option, extend him for 2 or 3 years at a cheaper amount. But even if you bring him in $20 to $30 million a year over 3 years, you've got other guys to pay. Jabari, Tari, eventually Reed, if he does pan out as they hope he does. So it's
Amen Thompson is absolutely going to command whatever version of the rookie supermax is available once that extension comes time. Yeah, so that'll be the end of next season, and thankfully, right, these extensions don't kick in until the following year. So it's like right now, this offseason, right now, Sengun and Jalen are both being paid on the final year of their rookie contracts. But then, as soon as this offseason kicks in, they're both being paid the top dollar amount that they got signed to when they inked their extensions just before this season kicked off. But that's the juggling act here, is the Rockets figuring out the timing of all of this and figuring out, okay, well, who do we guarantee we feel strongly that these guys are going to be here and be part of a championship contender, versus, okay, we've got to make a tough decision on this guy, or we've got to move on from this guy, or we can't have this guy's salary on the books when we've got to pay this guy who absolutely deserves this max contract. It's going to be really hard.
Yeah, and I can't believe I forgot Amen, so I'm glad you brought that up. He will get the max. But you're right. I think all along they probably felt that there would be a consolidation trade. But to be honest, a lot of these guys have really panned out or done well enough that you want to keep these guys. Tari's been good. Jabari, he's sort of been a mixed bag, but there's so much there at just 21 still, even. Has had a great game against the Lakers. You got Sengun and Jalen locked up, but as you mentioned, Amen, what are you going to do with Cam? And Reed is somebody you believe highly in. I think still they are positioned to make a consolidation move of some sort. That's something that Raphael's going to have to figure out. I do say I trust Raphael highly when it comes to contracts. That's one thing he manages extremely well. But yeah, it's very much TBD. This team could go in a variety of different directions, and a lot of it also depends on who becomes available in the offseason. That could shift everything. They've hoped for Booker. That doesn't look likely. What if Giannis becomes available?
Look, I was beating the drum before, but as it stands with the way that Jalen Green has looked throughout this season, I wouldn't trade Jalen for Booker at this point. I don't think it makes sense. I wouldn't do it. Wouldn't do it.
No, I feel that. I understand that. Absolutely. It's just interesting because before it was like Jalen, all these picks for Booker. I'm not saying you, just the entire view of it. I do wonder if it has shifted a little bit, but they've been very, very high on Devin Booker. Like, they really like him. So I would tend to still believe if he became available, they would pursue that. At the same time, Jalen has progressed. He's looked good defensively in a lot of stretches. He's become a better playmaker. Not great yet, but still better. So yeah, there's a lot to like with Jalen Green.
I think the fear for me here, and then kind of what I guess almost in a way spawned some of this discussion for me, is just, if the Rockets really don't feel like either of Jalen or Sengun is truly a 1A type option, if they're both, let's say, really good number 2 guys, then it's going to be really hard to feel great. Now, maybe Amen Thompson turns into your true number one guy, and then that's just your big three moving forward. And Jalen, Amen, and Sengun all live happily ever after together and win mini championships in Rockets Red. That'd be a great storybook ending. I would love that. That'd be a fantastic outcome. But I think the worry is that are you really able to pay those guys what they're being paid, in addition to paying all the other guys that you're going to have to pay the extensions and whatnot for all the people that we just named off, without either of them being true number one guys? And that's what this playoffs is really going to test, is those are your two number one options. Those are your two guys who on a night-to-night basis, one of them is your best player, one of them is your second best player, and they alternate between the two, and they have throughout this season. If one of them doesn't look like they can truly ascend to that 1A territory, and I get it, they're still young, they've still got time to grow, that's where the Rockets front office starts having to make some really tough decisions about, okay, well, you don't want to be locked into, God, I hate throwing this name out there because I don't want people to like freak out, but like, you don't want to be locked into like a Bradley Beal situation, right? Where Beal is, an incredibly talented player, but if Beal is the best player on your team, you're not going anywhere, right? And that's the unfortunate thing that happens sometimes for teams, is you get attached to or locked into a player that is very good, even an all-star caliber player at times. But if that's your best player, if your best player is just an all-star and not a top 20, top 15, top 10 kind of guy, it becomes really, really hard to win a title that way. And to, I guess, wrap it up and put a pretty little bow on our discussion, we go back to what we talked about in the first segment, right? The Rockets they haven't had a consistent go-to guy. Jalen hasn't become that guy yet. Sengun hasn't become that guy yet. Maybe one of them rises to that occasion here in the postseason, and then we have a renewed level of confidence in one of them being the closer, the finisher, the man for this Rockets team going forward. But it hasn't happened yet. And I'll be completely honest, Dave, I don't know if I have a lot of confidence that it's going to happen this postseason. I think we're going to walk away from whatever this postseason looks like, win, lose, what have you, and still feel like that's a big question mark that this Rockets team has to address. And I think they were hoping that they could just address it internally, that somebody would rise up and become that person. But if they don't, if there isn't an answer to that question by the end of this season, then I wonder if the Rockets start getting a little antsy, feeling like they have to make a deal to go get that guy in order to be in the same place or a better place next season, besides, number 2 in the West, which is still a pretty good spot to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to remind as well, just watching that Laker game Monday night, like what a luxury it is to have Amen Thompson, Dillon Brooks, Tari Eason to throw at guys like LeBron James, Luka Doncic, Austin Reeves. Like when teams have 2 or 3 elite options like that, which is kind of rare, but the Lakers do have that, you have some of the best defensive wings out there. And the Rockets have certain aspects of this team that are championship caliber. And like you said, you're asking the right question, in my opinion, is do they have that true primary, that true star on this team? Sengun and Jalen are still kind of in the infant stages. They're growing, but it's like, will they grow to be ultimately what the Rockets need? That is the question. And if not, Rafael Stone's going to have to find it, because he has a lot of great pieces to complement a star that is or is not on this team yet.
We want your thoughts on this discussion. Where do you think the Rockets are headed at, in this postseason? Or do you think we're maybe potentially overreacting here a little bit, jumping the gun a little bit on trying to figure out what this Rockets roster ultimately needs? Do you think the Rockets have their true 1A guy on the roster currently, or do you think they're going to have to find it elsewhere? Let us know your thoughts in the YouTube comments. Dave, do me a favor, let everybody know where they can track you down at.
You can find me at ClutchFans. The website's clutchfans.net. And talking Rockets every day.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform where you're choosing. Like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. Also, check out our Locked On Rockets newsletter. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.